Welcome back. With the emergence of Greece from the Dark Ages, around 750 BC, and the associated reinvention of writing, the establishment of Homer's great epic poems as the cornerstones of Greek culture, we've now come to the main period of Greek history. And over the next two lectures, first I'll want to trace some of the major trends which affected all of the Greek world. And then, I think rather than trying to just cover every little thing that happens, I want to focus in on just the two most famous Greek cities, Athens and Sparta, and outline their respective histories. As the individual city-states of Greece emerged from the Dark Ages, they underwent a very, very rapid population increase. And because of Greece's mountainous terrain, that meant that arable land was very scarce. And so pretty soon, a lot of these cities had a serious problem of simply having too many people and not enough land. But just as one characteristic of Greece's geography caused the problem, another offered a solution. As nature kind of predisposed them to do, the Greeks looked to the sea. And this began what we call the era of colonization. It lasted about 200 years from 750 to 550 BC. And during this time, most Greek states got rid of that excess population by simply loading their people onto boats and sending them out across the Mediterranean to establish new Greek colonies. These waves of colonists spread out all over the entire Mediterranean. And eventually at least 150 different Greek cities were established all around the shores of the Mediterranean. Some of them were up in the Black Sea, others were as far away as Spain or even France. One concentration of Greek cities was in Sicily and southern Italy. And there were so many Greek colonies established in that region that it became known as Magna Graecia, or literally Big Greece. Along with this whole colonization movement was the development of pan-Hellenic sanctuaries. And these were religious spots or centers that didn't belong to any one city, but instead served as communal gathering places for all of the Greek city-states. And often these sanctuaries were built around an oracle, a place in which the Greeks believed the gods spoke to and gave advice to mortals. Of all the sanctuaries and oracles, by far the most famous one was that established at Delphi. And during the era of colonization, Delphi established such a good reputation for giving really, really good advice that for all the rest of Greek history, whenever the Greeks face a particularly difficult problem or a situation where they're not sure what to do, one of their very first responses will be to seek the advice of the Delphic oracle. So the Delphic oracle really is one of the great institutions of the ancient world, and it will remain in continuous operation for over 1,000 years, from roughly around 800 BC up until AD 391, when finally it gets closed down due to pressure from Christians. By the way, if you go to Greece, Delphi is located in an absolutely spectacular natural setting. It's sort of clinging to the side of a cliff beneath Mount Parnassus, and if you're in Athens, it's a nice day trip to go out there and see it. The Greeks also believed that Delphi was the exact center of the world. And this is based on a Greek myth where, according to legend, two eagles began at either end of the world and flew towards one another. And the point at which they met was Delphi. And there's still a big stone today in the Delphi Museum, which the Greeks regarded as marking the omphalos, or literally the belly button, the center of all the world. Now, not only states would go to Delphi to seek advice, but also individuals. So private people could go to Delphi and try to get their questions answered by the god. And archaeologists have managed to put together several hundred of the questions which were asked of the Delphic oracle, together sometimes even with the responses that the oracle made. And these questioners, as I say, range from official delegations from cities asking advice on major questions such as should we declare war, to just ordinary individuals who are worried about kind of everyday or even trivial personal concerns. Let me give you a few examples of these. One of the questions posed by a city or a group was, which city does the god want to own the region of Leuke? And the oracle answered this, let a group start from each city at sunrise, and let that city which is first to reach Leuke and make a sacrifice there have it. Another question posed by a delegation was, a sacred snake was accidentally carried away in a wagon from Epidaurus. Should we take the snake back to Epidaurus or let him stay where he is? And the answer from the oracle to this one was, let the snake stay where he is, but establish a shrine to Asclepios, including an image of the god. We also have a number of questions asked by private individuals. And I think these really are one of our best sources as to the concerns that ordinary people had. Here's some questions that were asked which we actually don't have answers to. Will my friend help me? Will my child and I be reconciled? Will I become rich? Will I get a divorce? Will I get a vacation? And finally, a rather pessimistic question, have I been poisoned? The twin mottos of Delphi were know yourself and practice moderation in all things. And certainly both those statements are very good, useful advice. Most Greek cities also went through a period around now where they were ruled by dictator-type figures who would seize control of the state by force. And these men are known as tyrants. But it's important to note that the original Greek word tyrannos, from which tyrant comes from, didn't have those negative connotations that we associate with it today. Originally, a tyrannos was just a strong man, a powerful person. And only later on did it get the additional sense of someone who was cruel or oppressive. Many of these tyrants actually gained power as a result of popular revolutions in cities. So sometimes the poor people or the lower classes would feel that they were being exploited by the rich, and they would stage a revolution and put a popular leader in charge as a tyrant. Now, there were also bad tyrants. And very quickly, bad tyrants became associated with two key characteristics. First of all, the way you could spot a bad tyrant is he was always surrounded by bodyguards. And throughout the rest of antiquity, this would become a cliche almost of a cruel ruler. Secondly, they were known for arbitrary actions. For example, one tyrant renamed the 4 local tribes which made up the population of his city, and he had these tribes officially designated the pig men, the swine men, the ass men, and then finally his own tribe he labeled the rulers of the people. Eventually, most of these tyrants are overthrown. And this could often be a joyous occasion if he was a bad or unpopular tyrant. And a memory of one of these instances is preserved in an actual ancient Greek drinking song written by the poet Alcaeus. And it goes like this. Let's all get drunk, I mean really wasted, because Merciless the tyrant is dead. And presumably everybody then drains their glass. One very important innovation that begins during this period was the introduction of coinage into the economy. And this made possible a much more sophisticated economic system. The very first coins seem to have been minted around the beginning of the 6th century BC in Lydia in Asia Minor. But by the end of that century, almost every Greek city had begun minting coins. Now, unlike modern money, the value of the ancient coins was based on their actual worth, since they were literally made out of precious metals, bronze, silver, and gold primarily. Each city would stamp its coins with a symbol which represented it. Corinth, for example, would mint coins that had as its symbol the mythical winged horse Pegasus. So all Corinthian coins were stamped on one side with a Pegasus. These sorts of emblems made it very easy to identify what city had produced the coin. And so this also told you how dependable it was as currency, because some cities, everybody knew, had much purer metal content in their coins than others. Probably the single most famous and dependable coin of all were those of Athens. Since Athens was named after the goddess Athena, logically enough, Athenian coins had a nice portrait of Athena on them. And then on the flip side of the coin, they had a famous little picture of an owl, which was Athena's mascot. And you could go anywhere in the Greek world and pay with Athenian owls, as they were called. Let's look in a little bit more detail now at the city-state of Athens. Athens was by far the largest city-state. It had the greatest population, and it was the richest city-state. It's also the most famous, and this is mainly because Athens produced the most writers whose works have survived until the present. And so we simply know more about Athens than about other Greek city-states. Like most states, Athens went through a period when it was ruled by tyrants. Although the first couple attempts to establish tyranny at Athens were not successful. For example, my favorite unsuccessful attempt at Athens was in 632 BC, when a guy named Cylon tried to seize control of the state. And Cylon was a popular athlete. He had actually won the Olympic foot race a couple years before. And so I think he's maybe one of our earliest examples, maybe the earliest, of an athlete who tried to then capitalize on his fame by transforming his fame into a political career, though he certainly wouldn't be the last person to try to do that. His coup failed. He didn't get popular support, and eventually he and his followers were trapped by an angry mob in a temple in the middle of the city. Now, it was regarded as illegal, or actually an offense against the gods, to kill anybody who was touching, physically in contact with a sacred statue. So Cylon and his men came up with a clever idea. They tied a string to the cult statue in this temple, and then they began to leave the city, unrolling the string behind them. So in theory, as long as they were touching through this string the statue, they shouldn't be harmed, or it would be an offense against the gods. Unfortunately, when they were about halfway out, the string broke, and Cylon and his supporters were promptly stoned to death. As time went on, Athens was plagued by class warfare. There was steadily increasing tension between different classes, and certain groups in Athenian society started to become extremely unhappy over what they saw as injustices being practiced against their group. And the two most unhappy groups were, first of all, the poor people, especially poor people who had fallen into debt. Now, for a variety of reasons, many poor people in Athens were unable to make a living, even when they were working full-time. They just couldn't earn enough money. And so they ended up having to borrow money, which then they could not repay. The second group that was unhappy was rich people. And there was a group of them who were very unhappy because even though they were wealthy, they were not members of the aristocracy. And that meant that they were excluded from holding offices in government, because at the time you had to be an aristocrat to hold office. In 594 BC, all of these tensions reached a boiling point, and it looked like Athens was about to be torn apart by a terrible civil war. Now, it's at this moment that the Athenians do something incredibly bold, and it's really our first illustration of something that would become one of the key characteristics of the Athenians. And this is an extraordinary willingness to creatively experiment with different political systems. So when they face this crisis, the Athenians say, what can we do? And their solution at this moment is they pick the single man that they think was the wisest in all the state. And they gave to him sweeping powers to make any sort of reforms that he thought were necessary to save the situation. Well, the wisest man in Athens at this moment was a man named Solon. And so Solon instituted a number of reforms. First of all, he abolished most debts relating to land and claims on a person's labor. So overnight, all of these debts were erased. Now, just stop for a second and think about what that would mean. This is a truly revolutionary act. Can you imagine if today the government were to say that, all right, at midnight on such and such a date, all major debt is eliminated. All your credit card balances go to zero, all your home mortgages disappear, your student loans, all of it's wiped out. And the next morning, everybody starts out fresh with nobody owing anybody anything. I mean, doing that seems inconceivable. But the Athenians actually do this. That is a state willing to be bold and to experiment on a grand scale. Next, to address the concerns of the rich people who felt excluded from government, Solon begins by dividing up all Athenian citizens into 4 new groups according to the level of their wealth. And after setting the system up, Solon says that anybody who's in the top 2 classes is eligible to be an elected official, but those who are in the bottom 2 classes are excluded. And so this now pleases the non-aristocratic rich people. Solon's third major area of reform was legal issues. And he does a bunch of things here, but the most important one, the key thing is, he establishes a new law court, the Heliaia. And in this law court, all citizens had the right to appeal to a jury of their peers. And any citizen had the right to bring a lawsuit. So this reform is good for all citizens, because basically everyone now has recourse to the law for protection. So these are Solon's 3 major areas of reform. And while I suppose nobody in society was completely pleased with this, everybody did get something. So it's a good example of compromise. And Solon is himself a really interesting character. Not only was he this wise man and reformer, he was also a famous poet. And many of his poems describe his thoughts about his actions. For example, he has one poem which he describes how he tried to find a good compromise. I gave to the common people the rights they needed without stealing or adding honor. Thanks to my precautions, the powerful and the wealthy suffered no disgrace. I lent both sides my shield's protection, conceding to neither an unjust victory. Solon was not universally popular. Many people were not happy about this, and so they kept badgering Solon to change his decisions and to alter what he had set up. And so around this time, he wrote a poem in which he wrote, Keeping my guard in every direction, I whirled like a wolf circled by dogs. Eventually, he makes everybody in Athens swear an oath not to change his laws until 10 years have passed, or unless Solon himself changed them. And then, to force everybody to have to live with these laws, Solon very cleverly leaves Athens and spends the rest of his life traveling around the East. Eventually, a tyrant comes along who manages to successfully take over and hold power in Athens. This was a man named Pisistratus, and in 560 BC, he made one attempt, which failed. But then he had a second attempt, which succeeded. And it succeeded because of a very clever trick which he supposedly played on the Athenians. He found a peasant girl out in the countryside who was unusually tall. They say she was 6 feet tall, which would have been exceptional. And he dressed her up in a costume so that she looked like the goddess Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. And then he put her in a chariot and he sent her down into the middle of Athens, where she declared that she, Athena, wanted Pisistratus to be tyrant of the city. And amazingly, this seems to have worked. So Pisistratus then rules as a reasonably popular tyrant for a couple decades. That comes to an end, though, and what undoes his rule is the fact that Pisistratus had 2 sons, and the older of these takes over as tyrant upon his father's death, and his name was Hippias. And things were going along reasonably smoothly until a little incident which happened in the year 514 BC. In that year, the younger brother of the tyrant, named Hipparchus, became attracted to a beautiful young man of Athens named Harmodius. Now, this might not have been a problem, except Harmodius already had a boyfriend, a guy named Aristogiton. So when Hipparchus's amorous advances were rejected, he became angry. And in revenge, he refused to allow Harmodius' sister to carry a basket in the big state parade, which was coming up. Now, this all may sound a little bit silly, but carrying a basket in the parade was regarded as one of the greatest honors that could be bestowed on a girl. And so preventing her from doing this was a major insult to the honor of the family. The 2 young lovers, Harmodius and Aristogiton, were so offended by this that they decided to assassinate Hippias and Hipparchus at the parade itself. Now, they turned out not to be very good assassins, and they only succeeded in killing the younger brother, Hipparchus, while Hippias escaped. And then both Harmodius and Aristogiton were almost immediately killed by Hippias' bodyguards, and the whole incident seemed closed. All right. Why do I bother telling you all of this? Well, there's actually a very good reason. This little incident served as a rallying point for the elements of people in Athens who were opposed to the tyrants. And a few years later, it resulted in a revolution in which Hippias was expelled for good from Athens. And it was after the expulsion of Hippias that the Athenians then were inspired to establish a political system which, for the very first time that we know of, was based on the people wielding primary power. In other words, the first democracy. So, if you want to know the true origins of democracy, it all begins with an incident of male-on-male sexual harassment. So it was that in 508 BC, the Athenians were once again in this position of knowing that they wanted to make a major change in their government, but they weren't quite sure how to go about it. So they decided, let's repeat our Solon strategy. Let's turn over all power to a wise man and tell him, come up with a good new system. Solon at this point is long gone, but the wise man that they turned to was a guy named Cleisthenes. And it's Cleisthenes who really sets up what becomes the first real democracy. Cleisthenes was a wise man, And he realized that one obstacle to establishing this new form of government was that the Athenians had become fragmented into different factions which were based on geography. And just to simplify, basically there were three groups. There was the people of Athens who lived in the hills, the people who lived along the coast, and then the actual people who lived in the city. And each of those regions obviously had very different economic interests. And Cleisthenes knew that what would happen is that people from one region would all sort of clump together to support political policies that would only be good for their little section of Athens, not for the whole state. So Cleisthenes solved this problem by dividing up all Athenians into 10 tribes. And each tribe was a mixture of citizens drawn from the 3 different geographic regions. This organization ensured that no longer could members of one geographic region separate themselves out, but rather everybody had to work together within their tribe with people from all the other areas. He then set up something called the Council of 500, which was the main legislative body of the state. And it was there that most of the big political decisions were made. There were also some elected officials, but the Council of 500 became the focal point of power. And it was the place that new legislation would be ratified. Now, here's the clever part. How were the 500 members of this council selected? Well, each year, each of the 10 tribes would select 50 people to serve on the council. And here's the important part. Those 50 representatives from each tribe were chosen by a random lottery. Literally, all members of the tribe would put their names in a big clay pot, 50 would be pulled out, and if your name came up, you serve on the Council of 500, and you would help make the decisions that would govern Athens for the next year. This is very different from our current representative democracy, in which we elect others to represent us. But Athens was a true direct democracy, because every citizen had an equal chance of actually serving in the government. This is a radical system. And quite honestly, I sometimes wonder if today we wouldn't have a better government if every year we just randomly picked 535 citizens and shipped them off to Washington to form the Congress. The way the odds worked out, by the way, each person in Athens, each citizen, typically ended up serving on the Council of 500 2 times in his lifetime. Athenian democracy would go through some other changes and have some other additions. But one of the most important things that would add it on was a law that gave each citizen the right to get up and speak in the General Assembly of Citizens. So again, everybody had a potential voice in politics. Finally, the Athenians were having such a good time with all of these creative elections that they introduced one more. And this was a sort of anti-election. Once a year, the Athenians would get together to vote, but instead of voting for someone they liked, they would vote for the person they hated the most. And if more than 6,000 total votes were cast, the person who got the most was kicked out of Athens for 10 years. If he came back before the 10 years were up, he was killed. But at the end of that time, he could come back, resume his full rights as a citizen. And this sort of election is called an ostracism. And the first ostracism seems to have occurred in 487 BC. The name ostracism comes from the fact that to actually cast the votes, the Athenians would take broken bits of pottery and they would scratch the name of the person they wanted to be ostracized on it. And such a piece of broken pottery is called an ostracon. And we know a lot about who the Athenians disliked because pottery is indestructible. So after an ostracism, they would just take all the ostraca and dump them in a hole somewhere. Archaeologists have dug these up. And one interesting thing that they noticed when they analyzed the ostraca is that often a number of ostraca from the same ostracism were written in the same handwriting. Now, again, if you were an archaeologist, how might you interpret this? Well, a positively minded interpretation would be that since not everybody in Athens was literate, maybe literate people were helping out their illiterate fellow citizens by writing names for them. But a more cynical reading would be that somebody was attempting to stuff the ballot box with a bunch of false votes. And unfortunately, since the ostraka in the same handwriting usually all name the same individual, it looks like that second interpretation is the right one. So even at the very dawn of democracy, we already have political corruption. Sometimes people like to praise the Athenians for this wonderful democratic form of government. But keep in mind, it's only a democracy for those people who qualified as citizens. And there were lots of people in Athens who were not citizens. Women did not count as citizens. Children did not count as citizens. Slaves did not count as citizens. And there were a lot of slaves in Athens. And finally, foreigners who lived permanently in Athens, of whom there was also a large number, none of those count as citizens. All these various forms of democracy didn't last very long. They're constantly changing things. But the real political legacy of Athens is their experimentation. The way that they would try out different ways of sharing power in society. And in a lot of ways, the Athenian system is a deliberate reaction against ancient Near Eastern god kings, where all power is given to just one person. Various other Greek states also play around with forms of democracy. But the main exception was the city-state of Sparta. And Sparta will go off on a wildly different social and political path. And in the next lecture, I'll look at their story. Thank you.